basically, well, every startup that I joined, or every startup I found, basically has data problems or data needs. And these data problems and data needs are related to, initially, well, we need to, it's important. Data is important. If we can't measure it, we can't improve it. So that's one. Number two, inevitably, unless you're independently rich, startups are going to have to get funding. And it's from old days. It's becoming more and more formulaic. There's a set of SaaS metrics that venture community expects. So either at every round, either pre-seed or seed or A round, it's all about the numbers, right? So it's not the custom analysis that they used to do that runs the due diligence, runs months and months and months, and potentially getting into years. This is now pretty formulaic. On the first meeting, when you show them the numbers, they'll make a binary decision very quickly, whether this is the startup worth investing. So the core need, obviously, you shouldn't be keeping metrics just for the sake of investment. The metrics need to be kept for their own sake in order for you to improve. But that's something else that's needed, because you will have to, it's not enough to say the company is great, invest in us, right? You need to bring some metrics to the meeting, and really let the numbers speak for themselves and speak for the company, and describe the opportunity. So that's two. And as the company is growing, it's the way of communicating across different departments. So if you look at going back to your question, what metrics, and again, I'm mostly dealing, for the past 10 years, I'm dealing with SaaS companies, right? SaaS B2B companies, even though I have lots of experience with B2C, but where the metrics really need to, in what makes the business on the SaaS B2B side, is particular set of metrics. And these are probably the metrics you guys are familiar with. It's the CAC, cost of acquisition, lifetime value, churn, expansion, monthly recurring revenue, average contract value, yearly recurring revenue. Primarily, the three metrics that make the SaaS business work is the churn, it's the cost of acquisition, and MRR, ARR, that basically show the growth of the business. So when you're presenting these metrics to the investors, they'll ask you how quickly you're growing, months over months, year over year. How much does it cost for you to acquire the customers, and what is your churn, right? When you get them, what happens? Do they leave? So these are the core metrics that need to be captured. Now, again, these are primarily business centric, but as a CTO, either co-founder or a CTO at the company, you better have these answers before the questions come up, right? Because they inevitably will.
I love it, and especially because the last comment you made around the intersection with business. I know that COOs or CFOs might see this as sort of their domain, in terms of, because you've got to plug into your accounting software, you have to define these subscription types, you have to mess with product pricing. And I think it's just interesting for us as CTOs to play a very important role in that conversation around what our SaaS metrics mean for our business.
Absolutely. And even if somebody else is responsible for them, as it was with a couple of my startups, CFO or VP of finance would be presenting these numbers, and he or she is independent. It's somebody that the board will reach out to for these numbers, but they'll come back to you and say, please give me these numbers. And they're looking to you to enable them, either to produce it custom or give them a tool that will do that. And And some of these SaaS metrics are now implemented through a set of tools that you can get. But again, that they need to be, these tools are not magic. They need to have a source of data.
So I'm wondering, in terms of life stages of a company, whether you find that some metrics might be way more important in the beginning, whereas one can sort of start ignoring it or not placing so much value on it going forward.
Yeah, some metrics are a little more difficult to collect, especially in the types of businesses that you're describing. They're more enterprise type businesses versus SMB. So anything close to $1,000 AR or average contract value would be considered SMB, and going into the mid market, anything above $10,000 would be going into starting to go into the enterprise, and probably getting to $100,000. Now, some of these contracts, they're not very useful to look at from a MRR point of view, because your close cycle could be, your sales cycle could be 3 to 6 months, and that's what it typically is from an enterprise perspective. So as an early stage startup, you might not even have those numbers just yet. So you need to then switch to a pipeline estimation and look at your pipeline and look at your sales pipeline and where everybody is from a sales pipeline point of view, what stage of a sales pipeline they're in, and then you're valuing potential revenue that you will get. Then the numbers you're presenting is, hey, these are at the opportunity stage, these are at the closing stage, these are sort of mid stage, and our value of our pipeline is $2 million, and our typical conversion rate of our pipeline is 10%. But it's more or less applicable, like I said, to the enterprise companies. So if you can't, like I said, if you can't present the real numbers, you should be presenting some sort of approximation in terms of what's going to happen. Now, again, businesses are very different. You might have SMB businesses that are they're closed through sales. So they're sales-driven companies. Some are product-driven companies where the product sells itself. So it's called assisted conversion versus unassisted conversion. So you first need to understand what sort of business you're in, and then what sort of metrics you need to be keeping. And if something is not available to you, just sort of get creative.
We should spend a lot of time educating and equipping ourselves with what these numbers mean for sort of the future of the company, because it's black and white. It's right in front of us, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the more standard it looks, the easier it is to show it to other people and to get some advice and to get funding. The more you have to explain why things don't look the same or the same as they're expecting, right? So there's if it's not in the format, it's not in the template that they're expecting, then you get some questions, and every time you have to explain something, that's not great. So that's not great externally, and it's also not great internally. Initially, you're just a few people, and you're dealing with literally 1 or 2 people, and then it just expands out. The more people you hire, the more expectation you have in terms of what the numbers, what metrics are you tracking, what's expected, what are they used to, right? So every time it looks different or it's not capped at all, then it just makes it difficult for the entire company to communicate. So you could consider the metrics as basically how we all come together, right? So the meetings that are most productive is where you present the numbers and you talk about the numbers, as opposed to the opinions and what we should be doing and things like that, where the less the data, the louder the opinion.
Yeah, I guess I just don't know enough about accounting and how to account for it. But when you're looking at a cost of acquisition, what do you include in those numbers?
From a cost of acquisition, there's 2 ways to look at the cost of acquisition, and this really depends on if it's unassisted conversion versus assisted conversion. So when it's an unassisted conversion, they literally come into the product and they sign up, and you don't need salespeople to close them, or it's literally one phone call. Then what you're including in the cost of acquisition is just media, right? So whatever you're spending on media and PR gets bundled together, and that's the cost of acquisition, right? So anything you're spending on search, anything you're spending on display, anything you're spending on the social channels or comparative channels like Capterra and G2 Crowd. So anything you're spending on marketing sources, as well as PR, you're basically bundling it in as part of the cost. Now, also, in addition to that, you might be bundling it in personnel that you're using, right? So if I have 5 people on my marketing team, I take what they cost. I add in the cost of media, and basically that's the cost of my acquisition divided by the number of clients I got.
Okay, that makes sense to me.
And there's also a pipeline. There's a pipeline that you keep track of, and your basically cost of acquisition, you're starting to track everything from the top of the funnel, which is when they come in, and then drop off until the end of the funnel. So anything from a marketing qualified lead to a marketing captured lead to a marketing to a sales qualified lead, and eventually to a conversion. So it depends, like I said, depends on your business, and depends what sort of metrics, or rather what sort of steps in this pipeline are. Again, it could be, some enterprise companies don't have any media spend whatsoever. What they do is they have highly expensive or highly productive and hence expensive people that they deploy. So cost of acquisition might be everything that you're spending on your sales department. It just really depends, and the variability here means that either you're bundling in the cost of personnel or you don't.
Yeah, and I guess you want to get the most accurate number versus hiding it, maybe. But
I typically present 2 numbers: cost of media and also the fully burdened cost. And early stage, it matters, because if I hire, or rather, if I hire somebody, if I have a marketing department that has 1 person, and I just hire another, that just doubles my my cost for personnel. Now, when you have 20 people and you add 1 more, it's relatively modest increase. But still, breaking it down or breaking it out from cost of media versus cost of personnel matters. So you should present both numbers.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, and the thing that was a revelation for me about CAC was suddenly, if you start, or actually about CLTV, is if you start realizing that you're going to be making that money back, and then that ratio, it makes that marketing spend so much more valuable, because you understand what your lifetime value is.
Yeah, and it also matters if your cost of your acquisition, if you have the type of company where the expansion happens, your net revenue retention increases because you sell your product on the seed basis. So you're getting a client, and you have 2-3 seats that you sell together with that initial contract to get the foot in the door, and then you keep expanding. Then that it really matters. It affects your cost of acquisition, because then your break even period does not have to be from 9 months to a year. It could extend out to let's say 15 months or even 2 years. That would be fine, because you're not just retaining them, but you're also expanding them.
What tools can we use to start showing that transparency into our process, not only as a tech team, but as a business? Do you have sort of a standard go-to for tools that you like to use?
Yes and no. It changes depending on the stage of the company. So one of the ways that people look at technical stacks for reporting and analytics is sort of this one unchanging thing that just stays there for a very long time. You just kind of imagine, because as engineers, we do sort of backwards chaining. Where do I want to be in 3 to 5 years? And you start backward chaining to a current moment. What is it that I need to put in place? So there's a tendency to overbuild. Now, what I find is more productive is kind of look at the stage of the company I'm at, and I don't want to be behind where I need to be. And here's how I typically define it. At early stages, as a lot of the companies do, it's typically Excel spreadsheets, right? So it's like, well, you're a business analyst. Do you know Excel? Okay, well, here's Excel. Here's some data. Give me some reports, right? So that's the that's the first thing that happens. Then, in addition to that, what gets layered on is Google Analytics, right? So Google Analytics is the go-to for early stage startups. Then from Google Analytics, you start breaking it out into enabling, and this is where I've seen the companies take too big of a leap from Google Analytics to a full-blown BI reporting data pipelining solution, which is just too complicated for them and too expensive for them to undertake. So there's no intermediate step, which I normally take. And the intermediate step is to enable every department, is to give them their own tool, but to give them an operational tool that contains the reporting piece. So sales gets their own tool, marketing gets its own tool, product gets its own tool, and those tools inevitably will have some kind of reporting. And there's a set of go-to tools for every department that I use. For instance, I use Mixpanel typically for product and funnel tracking. I use Customer Success Box for customer success and customer support. And for the financial side, I typically use Price Intelligently or sometimes ChartMogul. That's the same thing. It's the financial tool. There's a number of options. These are not necessarily even the best. These are the ones I know, but I've done quite a bit of analysis with every which tool and some specifics where these tools are critical and important. So this approach is going to keep for like 6 months. You're gonna give them the tools, and they're going to be happy, and they're going to have their own reports. So inevitably, what's going to happen is one time or one day in the or rather the executive meeting, everybody will whip out their own report and say, "Oh, this number is different on yours than it is on mine. What's happening?" And the answer is going to be, "Well, we're going to go offline and reconcile." And a week later, people come back, and it's going to our tool keeps it slightly differently than yours does. So what happens? So if that happens between 6 months to a year. Once that happens, then what you need to do is to siphon off all that data, and now it's the time for you to start building the true data pipeline, and sort of a reporting analytics BI type solution. So I'm gonna be using some of these interchangeably, even though they don't necessarily mean the same thing, but it's something that brings all the data together, right? You need to build a data pipeline where you will take the data and you will combine it, you will homogenize it, you will clean it, and you will present it, and it will be a single dashboard that gets presented to, and it just reconciles the numbers. So that's basically the next step in the company, and it's usually 1 or 2 years or sometimes 3 years into the existence of the company, and it's it probably happens when you're right around 20, 30 people.
So to riff on that a bit, when you're sort of in the stage where I think most of us are or have been recently, the idea isn't so much to get everyone on the same dashboard, the same tool, the same reporting structure. It is in those sync up meetings or in those executive sync ups to allow each team to come with their reporting and analytics tools that they would want to implement. So as CTO, if my salesperson comes in and says, "I want to use this tool that will blah blah blah," and I feel like I want to vomit in my mouth a little bit, am I supposed to ride with them and help them, or do I need to put on the brakes and try to sort of get them aligned with how we report our data?
It's important to enable them, and if it's ultimately it's going to be their tool, and you need to let them choose it at the same time. If it's just something that's just not going to work, you need to you need to tell them, I tried this is not going to work, or this is 6 months or 8 months of implementation, and this is what my experience is going to be. So but at the end of the day, it's impossible to talk them into comfort with something that they're not comfortable with.
Yeah, okay, got it. So then you're saying when you're all reporting on data empowered by your own tools, you're saying then there could potentially be an integration step. I think this is what you're about to go into, sort of a reconciliation step. If your data says X and mine says Y, you go and do that reconciliation sort of offline to see what's up. But then at some point, it behooves us to now have some sort of dashboard where anyone can log in anytime to see what's up.
Absolutely. So again, it's they need to use operationally whatever it is that they use, and as long as the KPIs, what everybody agrees on, are the same, then you need to let them keep track of whatever it is that they're keeping track of in their operational tool. However, so they have a say what it is that they're going to use. What they don't have a say about is what are we reporting as an entire company, right? So that's where you need to, as a CTO, you need to weigh in. You need to say, okay, that's fine. You're using the operational tool, which I helped you pick, or you picked yourself, and you're doing the report out of it. But we need to have an ability to siphon off the data, and we need to build a data pipeline, and we need to present a canonical dashboard that all of us are going to go off of. So if a conversion rate here says 6% and yours says 8%, then you need to go in and figure out what's wrong with your data, right? Because ultimately, this is what we're going to go by, and this is what's going to get presented. To bring this all together, it's typical dashboarding, lightweight dashboarding that you are going to put on. So it's going to be either a Plecto board or a Gecko board or something of that nature, which has a lot of connectors to whatever it is that they're using, either a HubSpot or Salesforce or a Mixpanel, and you're putting it up on your monitors. And usually those are the churn numbers, the expansion numbers, the revenue numbers. So typical numbers that get displayed are basically customer success numbers, or customer service numbers, which is, here's how many phone calls we're making, here's our conversion rate, here's our expansion, here's what we're doing in terms of the revenue, there's our goal for the month or for the quarter, and here's how we're doing against it, here's what our churn numbers are, and here's how we're doing against that. And that's typically connectors into a couple of softwares. Like on the sales side, like I said, it's either a HubSpot or Salesforce or some other sales tool. There's a gazillion of them out there.
Yeah, and I know with tools like Mixpanel, you can, most of them have packages or gems or whatever to just actually log the events in your code. So I'm hearing you say sort of tools for specific purposes, and then on top of that, to use something like a Gecko board to start sort of putting together these dashboards that service those sort of larger, like you said, the customer numbers. And I think as sort of the technical lead, it probably makes sense for us to own that type of reporting, right?
It does. It's either a separate group that's under technology, or it's literally, it's not split up, but it's been owned. And when I say being owned, it's basically you own the data, you own and when you talk to business people about reporting, it's the difference between the hole and the drill, right? They don't care about the drill, they care about the hole, right? They don't care about the saddle, they care about horseback riding. That's basically what they care about. Now, they want to make sure that the data is clean, but again, they don't tell you that. They just want the numbers, and they want the numbers to be accurate. Now, when we talked about this lightweight reporting on top of all the solutions that have been brought in together, it's more or less an interim step. because usually what ends up happening is that it's no longer enough to just have the APIs to all these tools and to display the whole thing. You need to have a data pipeline built somewhere in between where the data can be collected, reconciled, cleansed, and displayed. You also have, in addition to some of the internal and external reporting that you need to do, there's a lot of times there's a need to either do some sort of machine learning or to do some internal other sort of internal reporting where you do analysis, and operationally you will devise a model that will work for make your business function. So it doesn't just have a reporting function, it also has a function of enabling the business. So that's sometimes you're presenting real-time dashboards to your customers. So the reporting then just sort of splinters off into these various needs.
So you're talking about a method to sort of buffer the collection to the view or the presentation of the data for us to either sanitize or machine learn or something with that.
Yeah, it's the typical what's now called a data pipeline, and there are various data pipelining solutions. It starts with data ingestion, and once the data has been ingested, then there's multiple forks from the data ingestion. It gets collected, cleaned, rolled up.
Are these tools like Snowflake, or like what tools have you used that you liked?
From a data pipelining point of view, there's third-party tools, there are open source tools. There's no shortage of tools. So okay. what I used Treasure Data as a data pipelining tool. There's also a Snowflake, a Snowplow, not to be confused with Snowflake. Snowplow is just a collection of a lot of third-party components, primarily Amazon, that you can build on top of. So they're pre-configured. Or you can go down to a separate components from Amazon or AWS and do that yourself. And now there's data pipelining tools like Illuma that has been just acquired by Google, or Fivetran, or the Stitch Data that has been acquired by Talend. So all of these tools basically represent the data pipelining solution, where the data intake, data cleansing, and then data forking. And there's various functions that get hooked up to it.
So we are in a bit of a weird place because we have some kind of non-standard data sources. Like we use Infusionsoft from way back when, and none of these services have like a built-in integration with Infusionsoft for our billing and just numbers and that kind of stuff. So we're in a kind of a weird place there, but we're also in a weird place because we're a bootstrap company. We're not reporting a lot of these numbers outside of our co-founders who actually are have roles at the company. So we're very like hands-on and understand the current data that we have. So we're a bit behind also on just getting the data aggregated and now we're running into some of those more advanced problems, but we didn't have that middle step outside of spreadsheets and manually pulling data. So we've got Mixpanel involved, and we're starting to throw a lot more data into there, but we're also probably not feeling we're at the point of paying a data collection intermediary for the whole pipeline, everything all the way up as well. Maybe that is what we need, but we also don't have the team built out for somebody to come in and build that and monitor that and maintain that for us as well. So for just kind of knowing that much about our situation, do you have any recommendations for where we should be going next with it? And specifically, I wrote in here, the next question that we have is looking at this data and how we're impacting it on cohorts of users. So how is the work that we're doing now impacting the next group of people who join in the next month or so? We're also having a hard time getting that data reliably and in a more automated way that we're not pulling all that manually every week to week.
So if you're gonna if you're gonna skip a step of enabling every department with their own tool, then the next step, and you don't want to pay Illuma, or you don't want to pay Treasure Data. You can compile it together, and your next step would be to either build a simple data pipelining solution with all the components that Amazon offers, or I don't know if you guys are on AWS or on Google Cloud, but they're pretty much equivalences to, from an architecture perspective, what you could do. There's typically a streaming solution like Kinesis or Kafka, and then there's then that data needs to be collected. I don't know if you have a mobile application or web application. There are usually some sort of set of events they get collected. Then these events basically get transmitted through a streaming solution. After they do, they settle either in the data warehouse like Redshift, or they sit on S3, or they sit in DynamoDB. It doesn't really matter. What matters is then you can go and analyze it and clean that data, and then start reporting on top of it. And then these are all standard components, which go from, they go from custom collection to Kinesis to S3 to Redshift, and on top of Redshift, you can put any sort of reporting solution like Amazon QuickSight or something else. So that's the Amazon pipeline. But again, there's similar pipeline that exists for Google.
Yeah. So maybe one distinction where I missed this and just kind of resetting this in my mind is at some point what we want to get is basically all the raw events from our app, as opposed to trying to take in data from our other systems like Salesforce, or in our case, Infusionsoft, and like these third-party billing systems. Like we know people are buying things in our app. We know whether or not they've canceled in our app, all the actions that they're taking.
Yep.
We're really talking about the next step is to move away from relying on any reporting from these third-party systems and billing systems and that type of stuff, and instead just collecting a huge amount more data into one of these other systems to then do all of that reporting on our own.
Yep.
Okay.
And that's usually the next step. So there's these third-party solutions. They have their own. It's usually a combination. They have their own data collection that they will send over, and also they'll accept your own events. And you could define these events and send it to them. In addition to sending it to them, you could send it to yourself, right? And that's where you need to be careful, because of there are going to be a ton of these events. You'd want to make sure that the sequence is preserved and they don't crash your systems and things like that. Typically, data pipelining solution that you will pick off the shelf, they'll have collectors. They'll have data collectors, and the architecture will be designed for that purpose. It won't crash your system. Now, if you have to do this yourself, it's not rocket science either. You basically define set of events. These events are not stateful. They're completely stateless, and you just send stuff over and you do the aggregation on your end.
Yeah, I find that those tools are generally free and cheap-ish initially, but they can get pretty expensive.
They can get pretty expensive as the business grows, the amount of data grows, and now these tools are basically ingrained. So the tool is not, your lock-in is really not the vendor that cannot be replaced. Your lock-in is with the vendor that now is fully interwoven into a fabric of your company, and that's what makes it difficult.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, because you're actually adding that code into your mobile platform, your back end, your data, and all that.
And even if all of that is standard, it's also training of people that are on top of that are working with a particular tool, and then also it's just the architectural hook-ends where if you're building, it just depends. If you're getting the entire data pipeline, then you will need to find the tool that replaces it, or you have to build it. If it's part of the data pipeline, then you will have to replace it, and it has to be, the inputs and outputs have to be exactly the same. Otherwise, it's just going to take some time.
Great. I think reminding everyone that this is being recorded, so when you have to play these answers in slow motion, you'll be able to write all this stuff down.
Sorry, I'll speak slower.
No, great. No, this is great. I think the data pipelining is a real revelation for me. I'm looking forward to looking into into those tools. I wanted to end off just briefly with a question around what types of analytics or what types of metrics are you reporting into your executive team, or what transparency level do you have for your for showcasing your dev team's progress and productivity to your executive team? So what things are just sort of best practice in your mind that we should be showing our C-suites?
Is that a question for me? I thought maybe if everybody else will chime in. Now,
I'm really good at asking questions.
Oh, no worries.
The metric that we should report back to our leadership on engineering.
From an engineering perspective, it's typically, what does the CEO want to know from a CTO? One is we're on time and on target for things, right? So if we said we're going to deliver something in 3 months, it's delivered in 3 months, and all your agile metrics that you're reporting, hopefully condensed so it doesn't put them to sleep. So you're producing things on time and on target. That's one. We're stable, right? So what you want to report with every new customer as we grow, our cost of per request is not growing, right? So every customer we bring on, this is how much does it cost, and it's not costing disproportionately more to bring on new customers. And this is how our technology is going to scale as we're bringing on new customers. And three, we're not producing disproportionate debt, right? So what you want to do is keep presenting, well, hey, here's how much of the technical debt is in the system, and this is what it really means. It's just quantifying it. Typically, from a technical perspective, that's usually what I present.
I love it, because you're basically seeding your leadership with, okay, I just want you to know our technical debt is slowly increasing, but this is how this is the cost and time it's going to take us to chip away at it.
And really quantifying it, because then I typically show them, here's what's in the backlog. I separate all the backlogs, and I typically try to keep all the CS and sales backlog down to 0, and all the technical tasks that are in the QA backlog, I try to quantify it and say, well, on average, we push out 50 things, and there's 200 things here. This is how much it costs for the team to produce this. It will take 2 months before we fully done with it if we started today, and that's going to be 200 grand, right? So this is a 200 grand burden that we're going to keep carrying, and this is what it means. It slows us down by whatever 10%, and then you can easily quantify it. Otherwise, it's just sort of amorphous thing that just, well, there's a lot of technical debt. Okay, well, what does that mean? Is that good or is that bad? Or it needs to be quantified. It needs to be something simple.